So my name is Beth Fisher Yoshida. I am the Program Director and Professor of Practice of the Master of Science in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. And we run monthly webinars during the course of the school year, which is mostly fall and spring. And I just want to make a couple of announcements before we move on to our special guest today. So in terms of other webinars that we have scheduled coming up, on October 9th, we have John Marks, founder and former president of Search for Common Ground, who'll be with us. And on Thursday, November 7th, we have Matthias Schranner, founder and CEO of the Schranner Negotiation Institute. And both of those webinars will be very exciting, just as today will be. We also have some other on-campus event sessions. We have something scheduled for October 8th, The Art of Diplomacy with Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt. And then if you're interested in learning more about the NECR program, we have some scheduled information sessions on Zoom. One will be on Thursday, September 5th, and the other on Monday, October 21st. And there is a QR code there if you want to link to the NECR events page where you can learn more about all of this. So right now I'm going to introduce Peter Coleman, Dr. Peter Coleman, who is a friend and colleague at the school, Columbia University. And Peter is a professor of psychology and education at Teachers College, Columbia University. He's also a lecturer in the NECR program and has many other hats at the university, which I won't go into, that would be the whole hour. And so Peter is going to talk about toxic polarization, which is something that, as we see in the world around us, is becoming unfortunately more prevalent. And with elections heating up in the US and other countries around the world this year, it might prove to be even more intense. Okay, Peter, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Beth. Good afternoon, everybody. Wish I could see you. I can't really see you, but we'll make this work. So I'm going to talk about political polarization today, which I know you're all steeped in, we're all living in, whether you're in the US or elsewhere. And I'm going to start kind of big picture and then zoom in on some specific things that you can do to navigate these times. I've been talking with a lot of different groups in different countries and in the US. Yesterday was a large business group, and CEOs are very anxious about the fall, about what's about to happen. Certainly at Columbia University, we're anxious about what's going to happen. Universities across across the Western societies, I would say, are very anxious about this. So let me give you some context. As I said, I'm going to start big picture. This is from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a report that comes out annually that sort of assesses citizens' trust in different entities. And this year, they started to look at polarization. And I want you to just look at this sort of mapping of polarization for a moment. And I want you to notice that what the difference might be between more severely polarized societies and those that they label as less polarized. Obviously, it's not every society is here. Some societies are at war, but these are those that are essentially not. But you may notice that there's a difference between those societies that are less polarized and those that are more or severely polarized, in particular Argentina, Colombia, the US, South Africa, Spain, Sweden. And hopefully what you'll notice is this, that the societies that are most polarized these days are societies that are considered, more functioning democracies. Those that are less polarized tend towards authoritarianism, authoritarian government, much more control over the citizenship, which basically means that when a survey goes out around polarization or other concerns about their country, people don't feel like they can honestly respond. So that's one reason they come up as less polarized. But it's also that polarization tends to grow in places where it's tolerated, right? Where dissent and different points of view are more normative or accepted. And so it's kind of an ironic component. Democracy, as you know, been around since 508 BC, as far as we know, and it really is the idea that the citizens have the power, right? That sort of a larger group has a power. And I will say that I was in Greece last summer and I was looking up at this Parthenon, and I was thinking about this sort of idea of democracy and when it was founded, and what a ridiculous idea it was, because it was at a time when you had kings and rulers and, the bishops or popes basically in charge of entire nations. And somebody said, we could just have the people in charge, and that somebody was this man, Cleisthenes, who was a lawyer and, was considered one of the fathers of the Athenian democracy, with the idea of having people, the citizenry, have much more power and voice and say in ruling and in decision-making and government. By the way, his uncle was a tyrant. So he had had an experience of someone in his family who was a ruler, who was a horrible, brutal ruler, which I think is interesting, that it was his insight that sort of said, maybe we should look for alternatives, right? Unfortunately, these days, in many of these democracies, we're experiencing what I will call toxic polarization. You know it well. If you live here, you've seen it here, around the country, a division over a variety of issues. And it's not just that politics divide us, but it's that politics seep into everything, or everything becomes political and weaponized. Major issues that come to the fore are weaponized. And of course, Columbia University has been much in the news because of the polarization around Israel and Gaza and the war there, that has really sort of crippled the university since last October. Very quickly became divided and contentious, and we've seen takeovers and protests and arrests, and it's been very problematic. I want to start by saying that America, we're seeing upticks in polarization again in most of these democracies and many different areas of the world. America in particular has been becoming more polarized at a faster rate than others. But it's not alone. We've also seen in Colombia and elsewhere these upticks. And in fact, the Latin America and Caribbean region has become the most polarized, the most rapidly since 2000. So, there are these different types of polarization, different places it's occurring, but it is a global phenomenon. And as Jon Stewart, the pundit and comedian, said, democracy isn't normal. It's hard. It goes against our basic instincts. I think particularly when the world becomes troubling, we tend to move into sort of tribal thinking and look for support more locally, and look to find people and groups to blame things on. So what I want to talk a little bit about is what I mean by this thing, toxic polarization, and then mostly what we can do about it. And as I said, I want to start kind of bigger picture and then focus in on sort of what you can do, or your community, or your family, or your workplace, as we move towards the end of my talk. I want to stress by saying polarization is not a bad thing. It's just a phenomenon that happens actually in science and in politics. In a two-party system like the US has, it's a good thing. It's great to have kind of passionate, informed, true believers from very different perspectives, some that are really trying to push more progressive ideas, some that sort of hold on to stability and history and legacy, and have them challenge each other. It does serve as a check and balance. And in the 1950s, in this country, there was too little polarization. There was a lot of overlap between the parties. And so we've been kind of striving for political polarization. Unfortunately, we've got there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want you to just have some sense of the dimensions on which people measure polarization. Mostly we measure how much members of the Democratic Party feel contempt or hate or dislike for the other side, and vice versa. And that's been growing for 60 years. Since the late 1970s, we have been becoming more and more intolerant of the other side. Our thinking becomes much more tribal, and which means that we don't have more nuanced understanding of issues. We basically just follow our party platform about what our positions should be on the issues. We perceive them, the other side, to be much more extreme in their attitudes and actions than they actually are, which triggers in us more extreme reactions, which is part of this dynamic. And at times like this, the more contentious voices, the loudest voices in the room, whether that's on Twitter or X or whether that's on mainstream media, get most of the attention. So that's, on Twitter, 80% of the content is put out by 10% of those that are more politically engaged and usually more contentious. So this is the kinds of things we're seeing happening as a component of this toxic polarization. Most concerning is that we're physically moving away from each other. And this has been happening for decades, in that Democrats are moving towards more urban areas, Republicans to more rural areas. But even within cities, this is New York City, this is where I live, in this sea of blue. This is where Columbia University is. And as you can see, Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn, very blue, but then you move into Queens, Staten Island, New Jersey, you see these sort of deep red areas. And that's what's been happening, is physically red and blue Americans are moving away from the other side and into their clustered communities. And that's highly problematic, because what we see in societies that become violent is that there's less kind of just day-to-day contact with people who have different opinions than you, different attitudes than you. And so physically moving away from each other is very concerning. And it does result in a support for political violence, an increase in that, or what they call stochastic terrorism, which means that the probabilities of people who may want to be violent or be inclined towards violence increase. Oftentimes because the elite, our politicians, are using terms that normalize violence, normalize blame and hate for the other side. And so people that may otherwise not be violent are more inclined to be violent. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing more and more attacks, threats, harassment against our political leaders, and that's in the Senate and Congress. I was meeting with the bipartisan working group a while back in Congress. All of them, with one exception, were all facing multiple death threats to themselves and their families. This is our national congressional members. But it trickles down. Last month, in July, threats against local officials doubled. They grew by 100%. And this is happening again more and more, where you have school board members and librarians in schools or mayors who are under threat, harassment, sometimes physical threats, stalking. And these spikes, again, are happening more and more. This particular spike was really triggered by the assassination attempt against Trump in Pennsylvania, but they're continue to grow. So this is part of, I think, what Barbara Walter, who is at Duke, but also works with the CIA, calls, assesses as the beginning of civil war, of the trajectory toward civil war. She has an algorithm that they apply to other societies around the world, that Langley, the CIA, applies to other societies around political instability. She sees America as showing strong tendencies towards civil war, but she said it will be different than what we typically think of as civil war. It's not going to be, muskets and uniforms on a field, but it's going to be well-armed militia in small groups that are decentralized but coordinated. And in fact, that's what we're seeing with these local threats against politicians, is that oftentimes there are multiple threats to multiple people by the same group. And this is a sort of experience of violence. About a year and a half ago on Christmas Day, across 5 states in the US, there were coordinated attacks on what they call power substations, and just really basically taking out a city or a town's capacity to offer energy to their community. And that just sows a sense of anxiety and a sense of instability, and that's sort of what they're preying on. So that's how she believes or how they see civil war taking place is not as organized armies, but as these kinds of decentralized groups. And finally, I just want to point out that this is part of a long-term trajectory. We have been, this is just escalation, or it's actually Congress and the Senate and Congress and obstructionism that we see at that level. And that has been increasing again since the late 1970s and continues to become more and more difficult to get anything done in Washington. And it's just one of the measures of political polarization that we have. But it is a decades-long phenomenon. And it's sort of a runaway train. And it leads us sort of today where my colleague Van Jones talks about sort of three potential scenarios for elections today. One would be that, you know, it's a tense and ugly election season as we expect, but there's a clear winner and it's generally accepted and certified. And that is scenario number one. Ideally, probably the best scenario we can hope for. Two is that it becomes contested. And the results drag on through the courts and other venues and escalates tensions, but are still able to be managed by, you know, the FBI and police and others, so that violence is kept at bay, even though sort of the hate and the contempt continue. And the third is a significant tip into political violence and instability, and that will reverberate across the world, because what happens here affects other nations. What happens in other nations affects us. But the US is really seen as a model. And the more unstable we become, the more likely other nations will follow suit. So those are the three election scenarios. What Van Jones was on this call with me yesterday, and when he was saying to business leaders is, you know, you really have to prepare for this third, because we don't, you know, it's not going to be like whatever happens in November at the election, that it's going to sort of, you know, be a vote and something's going to be decided and everybody's going to go back to work. This is going to be potentially a really long slog around instability and violence that we all have to be prepared for, at least conceptually. What I want you to understand, though, with this is that this is an extraordinary time. This is very unlike anything really, and this is unprecedented in US history. And there are a lot of reasons why, and people tend to focus on one, like Donald Trump or gerrymandering or money in politics. But when I did an analysis for my book, The Way Out, I identified a host of different things, and really believe that none of these specific things are by themselves responsible for, you know, what is now a 50, 60-year pattern. But what is responsible is when they feed each other. When you have a kind of negative attitude, for example, and so you prefer a news program or sources of news that support your attitudes, that feels more comfortable to you. It starts to shape your neural pathways, so it's just easier to watch them and turn to them. It's actually hard to change the channel, to even think to do that. So it becomes more effortful to process new information. And these things kind of feed each other. And what I argue is this is one vicious cycle in just our attention to news, or, you know, lack of attention to other forms of news or information. And this is part of what we call a cloud problem. This is a biopsychosocial structural problem. It's within our neurological structures. It's within our psychology, our social relations, who we hang out with, who we don't, right? Who our friends are, who we work with, who we don't, where we travel, where we don't travel, the media we watch, the internet algorithms that separate us. There are a variety of nested structures that ultimately contribute to this problem, which is vast and complicated and very hard to understand and very hard to address. And more importantly, is that what can happen with, you know, a constellation of problems like this, when they're basically feeding on each other, is that they settle into patterns. They settle into very simple patterns where we see them as the problem and we're victims of their craziness and their insanity. So we move away from them, or we disengage from them unless conflict breaks out. And what I want to point out is that this is happening both on the left and the right. There's a new book by Fareed Zakaria out about revolutions, and he's really talking about this dimension. he's saying that, there are this political spectrum, and we tend to associate good and bad with progressives or good and bad with conservatives. But what he's saying is that there is, on both sides, an illiberalism, a closeness, a tribalism that starts to take hold under certain conditions. And that's what we're seeing more and more, is both those on the left, we've seen a lot of this at Columbia University, and those on the right, which you can see in some of the news sources on the right, where there is this intolerant, angry blame of the other side. And this becomes chronic. This becomes addictive and chronic. And this is part of what happens is our world just gets more simplistic and coherent. As Kennedy said, what Robert F. Kennedy said is, what is objectionable and what is dangerous about extremists is not that they're extreme, but that they're intolerant. That evil is not what they say about their cause, but it's about what they say about their opponents. And that's what we're seeing, as you know, such a rise in. So when this happens, when our cloud problem starts to settle into very strong patterns that suck us in perpetually again and again, we have to think about these problems differently. Karl Popper said there are clock problems and cloud problems. These are cloud problems. They're dynamic, complex, hard to understand, hard to know what to do about. So we've been studying these things at Columbia now for 25 years and publishing them in these kinds of journals and papers, and then these books. And The Way Out was specifically about political polarization in the US right now and its implications for polarization around the world. The good news that I offer is that there are conditions where societies like ours that are deeply divided and antagonistic stop and change and really change course. The three conditions are: first, you need to have enough citizens that are kind of fed up with the status quo. They're exhausted by the vitriol. They really are seeking something else. And the good news is we have that. This is from Pew. What they found is that Americans feel exhausted when it comes to politics. They're sort of tired of being angry, but they're angry and agitated all the time. Very little sense of hope. And look at the terms: divisive, corrupt, bad, crazy, chaotic, messy. That's how we think about politics. So a vast majority of Americans, somewhere around 80%, are fed up. And that's good news. And it's led to a sense of instability. We feel destabilized. I mean, certainly COVID affected that, and the changes in our work lives have affected that. The levels of anxiety people feel to some degree due to the toxicity of our politics affect that. But many of us feel ready for change. We want something else. I mean, that's part of what I think you see with the enthusiasm around the Harris campaign, is that it feels different. It's not the same old kind of, mutually assured destruction of previous candidates. But in order to really do something about it, people need to not just feel exhausted and fed up and destabilized, but they need to see what to do. And that's why I wrote this book. I just argue that this state of toxic polarization is so powerful that it really requires us to think about it differently, and then to apply certain concepts or principles from science that have been studied for decades in different ways. And that's what I offer here in the book. And what I want to do is walk you through what this looks like at two levels. One is us. So, I have a story that I've written about in Time magazine, which is about a neighbor of mine who I became estranged from. He was a strong supporter of the other side. He started to say crazy, provocative things to me. I'd known him for 10 years. I've known him as a father and a grandfather. Seemed like a good enough person, but more and more his politics seemed to go off the rails. And so at some point I just disengaged from him until about a year and a half ago. And then I thought, okay, I've written this book. I have to try to walk my talk. So I reached out to him, and I went through this process that I'm going to walk you through, that I found not easy to do, but extremely useful and important to do. And so these are these scientific principles that I've been trying to apply to some of my more challenging relationships in my life. And I've been encouraging Columbia University to apply. I've been working in different places. I was in Colombia, the country this summer, working there with some of the leaders there, particularly in media. There are a lot of different systems. I was in Israel talking to a university there. But Columbia University, as I suggested in the beginning, has been a hotbed of division. It didn't have an infrastructure for sort of peace builders or de-escalation. And so when this most recent war in Israel and Gaza broke, it was easily weaponized on campus and continues to be a source of major problem. And some of that's, the students and their attitudes and their intentions, and some of that's just the culture of Columbia University. So what I've published here is something called the Great Reset, and it is my attempt to apply these principles, these 5 things I'm going to walk you through, to the culture of Columbia University. And I wrote these publicly, and then I started to work with the President Shafiq, who resigned about 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago now, on using these principles to sort of change the culture. But she ultimately decided to jump ship. And so now we're in a new administration, and we'll see how that goes. But let me sort of give you a sense of what these things mean. If you find yourself needing to speak across the divide, work with somebody, and just fed up with the status quo, it helps to sort of stop and reflect about your own intentions. And this is sort of a basic principle that so much of what we do is on automatic pilot. We really need to be intentional about this. So this is a recommendation I made to Columbia, is that they really need to see this not as business as usual, and let's have some just different disciplinary practices or different practices in a classroom. You really have to sort of say, this is an extraordinary problem. We need to sort of stop and reset and take this very seriously and work at a host of different levels. So that's what is required for moments like this. I did this when I went for a walk with my neighbor, is I really had to sit with myself and say, why am I doing this? What do I want to do? Because I know it can easily go bad. It's already done that multiple times. So what would it take to move it in a different direction? So it really does require that we move from kind of heuristic thinking, kind of quick thinking and automatic behavior to more systematic, intentional behavior. And then it helps to think about, all right, so what already works? So again, this is something that I've been stressing at Columbia, is they were rushing to put in new programs and trainings and things like that. And the first thing I said to them, and I'm sure Beth and others who've been working with the administration said to them, is, where are the mediators which are at the law school? Where is the ombud system that's here? Where are the clergy that are involved, the spiritual leaders on campus? Where are the student leaders? There are oftentimes an ecosystem of peace builders that are already engaged with the community and trusted with different sectors of the community. Why aren't they in the conversation? And again, this is not how leaders think. Leaders think, okay, we're in a problem, things aren't working, we need to bring in outside consultants and change this. And we tried to consistently say that's not the way you should start. You should start with who already is working. So understanding that about an institution that you're trying to change, or about yourself, like what are the conditions under which you actually feel like you're your best self? Or who do you know in your life that's actually very good at sort of crossing the divide and doing that effectively? And how do they do that, right? So ask yourself what already works. Complicating the story is an important part of this. This is a dimension that comes out of a lot of our research. But basically, all we're saying is that in times like this, as I said, things tighten up, we simplify. Our group is good, their group is bad. We blame them for everything. And if that's the case, we need to kind of break that up, and we need to do that intentionally, ideally beforehand. So one of the things I do is watch alternative news, right? I have my 3 or 4 channels or sources that I go to when news breaks. I forced myself to intentionally find other news sources on the other side of the political divide who I believe are smart, well-intentioned, and decent people trying to do the right thing, but who politically differ from me, right? So you don't have to listen to crazy people. Listen to people that you feel are maybe politically opposed from you, but are sort of in it for the right reasons. That complicates your experience and understanding of the issues and everything. And so to do that at that level, or to do it at Columbia, part of what we've been talking at Columbia is to look carefully at the groups. Are the groups segregated politically, right, in ways that contribute to the divisions? And are there ways to intentionally mix people, have them have contact with one another? Movement, we've found, is a critical dynamic. It helps us to physically move when we're stuck in our attitudes, and it really helps us to move with others. And so one of the things that Columbia's been looking at is our actions and activities that students can do together, right? Even students going out together, intentionally selecting who comes together, and then, have them work on community gardens or work in Harlem or work on, campus, but doing physical things together helps people synchronize and establish a little stronger sense of rapport and connection with others. So that is another principle that I've been encouraging Columbia to take on. And then finally, just recognizing that these are very difficult, ensconced problems. They're not going to be quick fixes for this. This is going to take time. Columbia's culture has been developing for decades, and it's really going to take time to change that. We have to think about the socialization process. And some of the things we do won't work, or will backfire, or will take a long time to work. So how we think about what we do sort of has to change. And that is just the idea that there will be setbacks. Whatever we do, we have to be mindful of them. We have to expect them and learn from them, which is hard, right? Because we're a society that's very impatient. But that is a critical component to working with these kinds of cloudy problems. So what I'm going to leave you with, because I know I want to jump on a Q&A with Beth, but I want to give you a couple of tools that you can go to that can help you think about how you would enact these. So there's a website, this group called Starts With Us, which is a nonprofit that's trying to depolarize the country, has put up a website on what we're doing. One of the things they offered is simply just 6 steps for mending a politically strained relationship. So this is following the principles I just talked about. But if you feel that you've become estranged from a brother-in-law, someone in your family, a friend, somebody you work with who you used to be better with, if you feel like you're trapped there and that you really want to work through that, you can go to this website. We'll send you the link, and it will just give you the steps to walk through to think about how you might approach that relationship. It's like what I did with my neighbor. There's a more comprehensive approach, which we call the polarization detox challenge, which if you really feel mired in this anger and outrage, this is a 4-week challenge. And basically it works week 1 on you and you reflecting on you, week 2 on your in-group and whether or not you can be candid with your in-group and honest these days. Week 3 is figuring out, if I'm going to reach out to somebody, how do I do that? And week 4 are finding things where you can move together, groups that are actually doing work together across political divides, helping your community or addressing certain problems. So that is also available. We'll send you a link to that. And then the new iteration of this is an app that a group of our doctoral students are working on, which offers you different ways into this. 4 weeks, for some people, it feels like just too much. So basically what they've been developing is saying, well, there may be different reasons why people would want to take a challenge or work through some issues. It might be that they're trying to reconcile a relationship. It might be they just want to detox themselves because they feel like, so gross from all the hate that we're consuming. They may want to think about, how do you challenge your in-group in ways that are effective and constructive, what we call the good troublemaker path. Or you may want to actually, become an activist, but a kind of reasonable or effective activist that can actually affect change but not alienate. And then the third is just developing the skills to work and talk to people across the political divide. So we have this new app that's in development that we hope to launch sometime in the next couple of months. Um, these are all opportunities. This time of ours is an opportunity for us to learn about ourselves and our own group and the issues. And so we invite you to join us. And Beth, I will leave that there and turn it to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. So I'm glad you had a couple of recommendations because that was very depressing. Not
Well,
anxiety producing, just depressed, just basic depression. But
that's
I did like the three basic conditions you were talking about being fed up and then the destabilization and seeing a way out. So before I open it up to some questions I know that have come in,
yeah.
just want to ask that I know that you've been working on ripeness over the years. I know Zartman has been working on ripeness, and I'm wondering what are ways in which we can foster ripeness? So if conditions aren't quite ripe yet, what are some things we might do to speed up the process to become ripe?
Well, so ripeness has these two components. One is significant pain, right? That you have to feel like you're stuck, they're stuck, that we're not, this isn't going to work. This is going nowhere. And that is really sort of where the country is. That's where 85% of us are. And so I think to some degree, recognizing that you're not alone, that the vast majority of certainly Americans, but also Colombians and in other nations are really fed up and want a way out. But then offering specific ways to do it is what I think is critical, because what Zartman says is you want to be miserable and you want to see how to get out, right? And it's that second part that is a little more confusing to people. They know they're miserable, they don't really know what to do. So I wrote the book for that, but then what we've been trying to do over the last year and a half is make these things more actionable so that you, if there's a particular relationship, could try it on there, right? Or if you just want to detox, here are some exercises. Or if you just want to work with your own in-group, right? Because so many of us can't be honest with our friends anymore about our own opinions on issues. So if that's what you want to take on. So what we've been trying to do in order to increase ripeness is increase a sense of what actually people can do to give them a sense of efficacy at this time that feels depressing and overwhelming.
Yeah, that's great. I like the idea of linking all the great theory that you've developed in research into very practical applications that are kind of like size like sound bites that people can actually use and do in steps to increase things. That's great.
Right.
Super, and look forward to the app. So let's see some questions here. When is it okay to call racists, bigots? When is it, oh, to call racists, racists, bigots, bigots, misogynists, and so on, traitors, traitors? These are all negative things. Should we stop shaming negative behavior we as a society have already deemed unacceptable for the sake of polarization?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, again, what I would say to whoever asked that question is, what do you want to do, right? If you meet someone and you think they're being racist or they're being misogynist, if you feel a need to sort of call them out and publicly and shame them or attack them, have at it. But know that that will probably shut them down, alienate you more, right? And that's how that will unfold. If that's what you want to do, I say do it, right? If you hope to, if this is someone in your family, right, that you hope to eventually break through and have a different dynamic with, then you need to think intentionally about how you would go about that. Like, part of what I say to my activist community is we have to be able to hold two contradictory thoughts at the same time. One is that sometimes it's often important for us to fight the good fight, and we don't want a civil war, and we don't want to lose most people in our relationships, right? We somehow want to be able to do both. So how do we do that? F. Scott Fitzgerald said that the sign of a true and first-rate intelligence is the capacity to hold two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time and still function. That's what I'm encouraging people to try on, is not just be an activist, but also, let me just say, Robert Talisse has written about what they call effective activism. And effective activism has two components. One is mobilization against the problem, right? That's the second part. The first part is a kind of critical reflection on your own positions, your moral clarity about those positions, asking the hard questions about the unintended consequences of your attitudes or your actions. And that effective action is both of those, effective activism. It's really reckoning with your own position and activities and then mobilizing. And what we do in this country is we mobilize, right?
Mhm.
And that's what activists tend to do, is that let's just go if there's a threat coming. We don't spend enough time reckoning with the consequences of our actions, of how our activism does that. And if you read the first chapter of The Way Out, there's a story of pro-life, pro-choice women that came together and how hard it was for them to kind of work through their differences, but how important it was for them to come to terms with how they were contributing to some of the problems themselves through their activism.
Yeah, it reminds me of the work of Martin Buber when he talked about the tension and dialogue of being like holding on to your own belief system that makes sense and then
Yeah,
being profoundly open to others. So it's that tension that is an uncomfortable feeling, but it's a necessary tension that we need
yeah,
to move
right.
past.
Yeah.
Great. Another question. If democracy tends to dictate the extent of polarization in a country, does that mean countries with less polarization are even worse? I come from India, and I know we are not welcome to give out any criticisms against the running government, and that's become bigger and bigger issues by the day.
Well, so I wouldn't say that democracies dictate polarization. I would say that democracies may be more susceptible to polarization and more honest about its existence, right? So again, in this Edelman report, or Edelson report, I think that part of it is that societies that are more constrained, controlled, more autocratic, people don't feel like they can share their real concerns, right? So I do think that this type of divisiveness and polarization is global. There's some places where you simply can't talk about that. I work with journalists in India, and I know that there is great concern they have about their own safety and freedom and the constraints on them by government officials about what they can and can't report on. So there can be a lot of pressure in those societies to not, investigate certain issues, not investigate the government. So again, I don't see it as causal that democracies dictate polarization. I just think that they're more susceptible to it. And that's part of why we're seeing this sort of epidemic of this.
Could it be that it's more open and apparent because in other kind of political systems, you don't necessarily get to hear other voices?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
definitely a component of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. When do we invite others, people we love, but with a different political point of view, to join us in resetting? And when will ripeness appear?
There's no answer to the second question. It depends on you and them and, your willingness to sort of sit with difficult conversations and tolerate these differences. We're so quick these days to exclude people, shut them off, shut the door. And that, of course, just prolongs the problem or prolongs the tension in the relationship. So what was the first part of the question? Part of the
First part is when do we invite people we love with a different political point of view to join us in resetting?
Yeah, so I would say when you're ready. All right. Look, it takes two to tango, and you can't necessarily make others change, encourage them to change, demand that they change. You can take a hard look at how you contribute to the tensions or dysfunction in your relationship and ways that you may approach it differently, like asking them to go for a walk, right?
Mhm.
Asking people to walk outside, side by side with you and have a conversation which is what I did with my neighbor, is a very useful way to try to change the dynamic, right? It's not just sitting across the table and blaming the other side. It's physically moving together outside can help, right? But again, you can't guarantee what they do. You have very little control over what they do. You have a lot of control over what you do. The question is, are you ready to do it?
Yeah, it's interesting you say ready. It's also ready to make the first move because sometimes people say, well, I'll be open if the other side comes and
Yeah,
says something, but they don't know that.
yeah.
All right. Do you know if anyone is doing work on the mental health consequences of sustained polarization that folks in the mental health field could adapt? And thanks for your work.
Yeah, well, there are definitely people that are working on aspects of it, particularly social media, the role of social media. John Haidt has just written a book called The Anxious Generation, and he's been looking at the, deleterious effects of social media, particularly on young people, particularly on young women. The data is pretty strong on that. And, you know, social media is certainly at Columbia, at the university, it's a critical place where the problem is, right? So it's one thing to talk about classrooms and faculty and rules. It's another thing to be able to understand, control, moderate these social media spaces. And that's where so much of the harm is done and people spend so much time. So yes, there are people that are studying pieces of polarization. We tend, I mean, yes, there's some research on it, but it's always hard to tease out. Like, you know, the anxious generation. So Gen Z and the generation coming up behind them are, there's higher levels of anxiety, stress, suicidal ideation, isolation. People feel very alone. These are chronic things that younger people are feeling. Is that all political polarization? No, it's also social media, COVID, norms and tendencies. Dating has changed. You know, there's so much change, but political polarization makes it harder if there are people that you used to talk to that you won't anymore because you've canceled them, right?
Yeah.
So it's a contributor, and that's usually how it's studied and seen, less as a sole driver.
So it sounds like there's just a heightened level of anxiety that makes us more prone to these kinds of feelings in the
Absolutely.
population.
And again, let me just say that there are bad actors. There are, you know,
Yeah.
social media platforms, mainstream media. There are politicians, you know, they weaponize the us them. They weaponize the blame. And so there are industries out there that are preying on our susceptibility to this. And so to some degree, it really comes down to us as individuals and as consumers to push back and say to Facebook, no, you know, I don't want this anymore, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. We have time for a few more questions. One person wrote, I think that a major cause of polarization is fear. People are afraid of not getting what they want or losing what they have. Are there ways to assuage underlying fears to help address polarization?
I think that's true. I mean, again, I think fear is of such a fundamental aspect of the human experience that's been around since we've been around, right? And we've not seen this kind of tribalism in this country, you know, until now. So fear is definitely at the core of it because oftentimes our fear of threat from them is a primary thing that people weaponize to mobilize us, you know, against them or in service of a politician or a, you know, a cause. Um, so I think being mindful of that, being aware of that can help us, aware of the fact that, I mean, look, I do say to younger people, you know, we're suckers. We're being played. We're being played for the benefit of industries, right? And if you're okay with that, enjoy it. But if not, we need to find a way to push back as consumers and say, you know, we won't take this anymore. And I haven't really seen an organized movement to do that. There have been some attempts at them, but they've mostly failed, right? You know, these social media platforms, as one example, are so powerful and they're so omnipresent, and people are so addicted to their content that we can't imagine organizing against them. But I think citizens, and particularly younger people, really need to do that.
Yeah, the silent majority again. The politicians who are supposed to be our leaders are constantly attacking the opposition with these words. Shouldn't they stop their negative behavior?
Amen. Yeah, I mean, again, this is an interesting change in the Kamala Harris, Tim Walz campaign. Is that, you know, even Biden was really talking about Trump as a threat to democracy, and that's what Trump does. So it really was more of the same. And they've kind of flipped the script. It's not that they don't say that, you know, Trump is problematic, but they don't spend a lot of attention on that. They really spend attention on what can we do together? How can we come together? And what are the great things we can do? And trying to infuse a sense of joy and, you know, back into. So I do think that that there, it depends on whether that resonates with the society. You know, I think MAGA and Trumpism resonated with a lot of Americans because they felt frustrated and irritated and left behind and ignored, and they felt contempt from the elites. You know, I think you need politicians that both care, but then also offer something better. right? And I think that could be a very powerful message these days, assuming people are tired of the negativity.
Yeah, you talk about right the fed up part, which is right one of the things that changes. I think we have time for one more question here, and I encourage people to reach out if they have questions that are unanswered. What's the role social media is playing in simplifying conflicts and increasing polarization? I think you did address this a little bit. What would be a good code of conduct for those who are using social media and willing to ease polarization?
Right, so I'll point to some research. So Wikipedia is an example of a platform that doesn't tolerate politicization and polarization. So they have norms. So if you want to contribute to Wikipedia, you have to follow their norms. And if you cast aspersions, if you say negative things, if you put untruths on Wikipedia, they block you and you're out. So if you want to contribute, I mean, what they find in Wikipedia is when you have people with very different political persuasions contributing to content, it's much better. It's more nuanced, it's smarter, it's more accurate. But if you cross a line, they throw you out. So that is just one example. Reddit has changed my view. One of our students, Philip Rupert, is doing his dissertation on that. Change My View is a subreddit where people talk about politics and they sort of celebrate when I can change somebody's attitude, right? When somebody's attitude changes, they applaud it and they get points for that, right? So there are examples of social media platforms. I would say LinkedIn as well. I think in LinkedIn, you have a lot of skin in the game because you're trying to foster a professional reputation and a network and build a lot, relationships and get hired and increase your reputational value. And so people are much more careful, I think, on that to not go off the rails. So I do think that there are areas in social media that are doing that well. But I will say one of the stories I tell in the way out is being at a meeting with a couple of the founders of Facebook and some executives, and them really sort of coming to the realization that there's no space on their platforms for people to learn from each other and to open up. It's all about competition and coercion and contentious and challenge. That's what they're organized for. That's their business model. They know it. They're unwilling to change it. And so it's going to take consumers that will do it, because the major platforms are pitting us against each other intentionally because it keeps us addicted and it keeps them in business. And
Yeah.
so, again, they know what to do. They're just not willing to do it yet.
Wow. Well, we are out of time, Peter. I know there's so much more you could say and so much more people want to know. So what is a good way for people to learn more about the work that you're doing?
Send up a flare. Send it up in the ethos and I'll see it. No, just email me. You can find me, through the NECR program or Columbia. Just search me. Probably have too much internet presence, so you can find me and send your questions, and I'm happy to engage. And I do want to point people. We'll send out these slides. I think Kirsten had mentioned that I can send
And
out
we do have a recording. Yeah.
and the recording. But on there, you can go to the Starts With Us page for the Polarization Detox Challenge or the relational thing. And then when the app comes out, we'll share that as well. This is all for free. None of it is, there's no money involved in any of it. So these are just opportunities for you to build up your own resilience in this time when we all need to get stronger.
Yeah. Okay. So everybody, it's good to know that Peter's not hiding. He wants you to contact him and you can find him and take this on yourself. Peter, thank you so much. And for everybody else, I know that Kirsten put a link in the chat for other NECR events. And thank you all for joining us today. And the recording will be available and the slides. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Have a good fall, everybody. Good luck.